What if the first person who introduced you to magic wasn't a book, a YouTube video, or some mysterious stranger, but your great grandmother? What if, as a child, you watched her light candles, arrange religious figures, draw strange symbols, whisper words you didn't understand, and somehow turn an ordinary room into something that felt completely different? For me, that wasn't a movie. That was my childhood, and the fascination for the unknown eventually became a 16 years journey into witchcraft and occult practices. But I learned something along the way that I wish someone has told me when I was a kid. Curiosity is powerful, but curiosity without knowledge can take you places you're not prepared for. So today I'm going to tell you my story, the beautiful parts, the terrifying parts, the mistake I made, and what I learned. And along the way, we're going to talk about what actual witchcraft is, where some of this tradition came from, with my great-grandmother's altar looked the way it did, and why understanding the history behind occult practices is so important. Because this isn't a video about convincing you that every strange experience has a supernatural explanation. It's about telling you what I experienced, what I believe at the time, and what 16 years of learning have actually taught me. When I was little, I used to spend a lot of time with my great grandmother, and she really fascinated me. She was like one of the figures in my life that I looked at her and I was like, I want to know what you know. She had this relationship with the spiritual world that to me seemed completely natural. She would create little altars with candles, religious figures, symbols, and objects, with meaning I actually didn't understand back in the day. There were figurines of Jesus and the Virgin Mary, for example, but there were as well like strange symbols. There were candles, there were prayers, there were things that from a child perspective looked like magic. Sometimes she would perform what she describes as healing work, sometimes protective work, and sometimes things that, at least in my young mind, I understood as curses. And I was fascinated. I didn't have the vocabulary back in the day to explain what I was seeing, and I didn't know about folk magic. I didn't know also about ceremonial magic. I didn't know about Catholic folk traditions or the way religious practices and magical practices have historically overlapped in many cultures. I just knew that my great grandmother seemed to know things about a world I couldn't see, and I wanted to know as well. Before I continue with my story, I think it's important to clear something up. There isn't one single thing called witchcraft. The word covers an enormous range of traditions, practices, beliefs, and cultural histories. People have practices form of folk magic, divination, healing, protection, rituals, and spiritual practices for thousands of years. Ancient civilizations, including Egypt, Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia, and many others, had their own magical and religious traditions. It is important to remember that the modern idea of witch isn't necessarily the same thing as what people historically meant by magic or witchcraft. In medieval or early modern Europe, for example, beliefs surrounding magic existed alongside Christianity, medicine, superstition, astrology, herbalism, and religious ritual. And sometimes these worlds overlap. The overlap is actually something that reminds me a lot of my great grandmother's altar, because her practice wasn't merely separated into categories. It wasn't. This is religion, this is magic, this is spirituality. Everything existed together. A statue of the Virgin Mary could sit beside a candle. A prayer could be used alongside a ritual. A symbol could have spiritual meaning as well as a magical one. And this kind of blending isn't unique to one family or one country. Folk traditions around the world have often combined elements of different religious and cultural systems. As I got older, my curiosity became much stronger. I started to look for information myself, and like a lot of people who became fascinated with the occult, I went down a lot of the rabbit holes. There was a demonology, ceremonial magic, sigil magic, protection rituals, spirit work, occult symbols, old grimoire, and eventually I started trying things. Now, one thing I want to make very clear is that I'm talking about my personal experiences and beliefs in here. I'm not telling you that a supernatural explanation I gave to those experiences as a teenager was objectively what happened. Looking back, there are many possible explanations for some of the things I experienced. By the time, they felt completely real to me. And that distinction matters because when you're a kid, you don't necessarily have the knowledge or perspective, let's say, to separate fear from expectation, coincidence, or altered perception, perhaps, cultural beliefs as well, and generally unexplained experience. And back in the day, I definitely didn't. So one day, I decided to kind of experiment with demonology, mainly because the idea of maybe like seeing this like weird figure of like obtain power through this demon and stuff, it was something that was kind of, fascinating me. Like now, think about a kid mind when you say, I don't know, that demon can make you fly or whatever. Obviously, you're a kid and you're like, oh, I like this, I want to do it. So I approached demonology, and I approached it probably in the most irresponsible way possible. I found an old book. In this old book, there were Latin invocation. So I thought, okay, let's see what happened. I lit a candle. I created what I understood to be like a ritual circle, and I performed this invocation. Now, during this whole invocation, I decided as well to kind of, keep my cat with me because we know cats can see and perceive things that actually humans cannot. So it was like if something is happening, she will perceive it before me. So that was, let's say, a way for me to know it was working. So I performed this invocation and I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. Now, I didn't understand the historical context of the text. I didn't understand the tradition it came from. I didn't understand the symbolism. I didn't understand the psychological effect that the ritual could have. And I certainly didn't understand the importance of the preparation, the boundaries, and having someone knowledgeable to guide you. So at the time for me, magical was basically read the words, light a candle, do the ritual. Equal, something happened. It isn't that simple. And whether you approach magic spiritually, psychologically, symbolically, or as a combination of those things, rituals deserve understanding because you are working with symbols, expectations, emotions, attention, and sometimes very intense psychological state. Now, nothing dramatic happened that night. Everything was fine. I didn't see anything. It was everything like, meh, okay, whatever, nothing happened. Or at least, nothing that I could immediately point to. The only thing that happened that night, it was my cat. My cat, she started to behave very weirdly. She was very strange, very like, I would say kind of aggressive, but she was just like meowing and being aggressive, like leave me alone kind of vibe. which fair enough, that's what I did at the end of the day. Then, over the following months, things started happening that genuinely started to scare me. I began to see figures, black shapes, large shadows, and sometimes they seemed to be standing behind curtains, and sometimes I would see what for me it looked like a head resting on the top of a cupboard. Sometimes I felt like those shapes were genuinely staring directly at me. And obviously, as a kid, I was terrified. At that age, I interpret these experiences through, let's say, the framework I had to create for myself. I had been reading about spirits, demons, entities, rituals, and unseen words. So naturally, that became the explanation my brain wished for. But today I'm much more careful about saying I saw a shadow, therefore it was an entity, because we don't actually know that. Human perception is complicated. Dark rooms, peripheral vision, sleep deprivation, stress, anxiety, um, I don't know, expectation, and the brain's tendency to recognize patterns can all create incredibly convincing experiences. And there are experiences people have during transitions between sleep and wakefulness that can feel extraordinarily real. So, what I experienced was real as the experience itself. The explanation, that's something I can't really prove. Eventually, the figures, they became less frequent, and then at one point they just disappeared, or at least I stopped to see them. And I thought, okay, that chapter was over. Well, it wasn't. Years later, I entered into a relationship with someone that I've been talking with for 3 years. After 3 years, we decided to meet up, and after a few months, we decided actually to move together. Now, at first, everything was completely normal until one day. I came home from school and I walked in the house. He was sat there in the darkness, just few candles on, and he was staring at the mirror. He was mumbling something. I couldn't understand what he was saying, and I couldn't properly see his eyes. For me, they were like fully black, almost like my eyes now, let's say. So I kept calling his name once, twice, and then again. Eventually, he responded, and it was like almost like he suddenly came back to himself. He was normal again, but the experience completely disturbed me. It kind of made me wonder a bit, what actually did I see? What did I actually experience? Why this was happening? And what made even stranger for me was the fact that back in the day we had two cats together. They were very playful, very around, very like cuddling. But that day, those two cats, they were hiding. They were hiding in the. We had like a walking in changing room, and they were hiding in there, and they were genuinely terrified. Um, Honestly, I didn't know why, and honestly, I kind of didn't want to find out. The experience became one of the reasons I then decided to leave that relationship and to kind of, get out of that house. I eventually spoke with my great grandmother, and her reaction was actually completely different from mine. I was scared, she wasn't. She basically told me, "Don't worry, I will work on it." She created her altar. She lit her candles, Jesus, the Virgin Mary, symbols, prayers, the whole thing. Then she told me, "Take the trousers you're wearing, take them off, place them in a bin bag, and burn them." For me, that was a bit weird. So I soaked those trousers in alcohol. But the weird thing is, now we all know where there is alcohol and there is a flame, everything catches fires immediately, or almost immediately. I spent 45-ish minutes to light those soaked in alcohol trousers. They weren't taking fire. And when they had completely burned, because at one point they did take fire, and they burned completely, the strange thing, it was the shape that the fire left on the floor. That shape looked almost like a human shape with horns. And that was very weird for me. And in my brain, I think, what the hell I'm looking at? To this day, I don't claim that the shape was supernatural. Burning fabric, ash, melted material, and those object collapse can create incredibly recognizable shape, let's be honest. And our brain are also extremely good at finding familiar patterns in randomness. But when you're already immersed in an occult world, um, something like that can feel almost like a confirmation on the experience, or that experience that actually stayed with me, the experience which I told you before. But that was over. Now, years passed. I entered my longest relationship, 7 years together with this person. One night, and this was pretty much at the very beginning of our relationship, my ex-boyfriend woke up. He told me that during the night he had seen a black figure reaching his side of bed, and according to him, the figure woke him up and told him to just say hi to me. And then I remember thinking, this again? Because in my mind, it felt like whatever had happened years earlier had never really disappeared. Maybe it had simply stopped showing themselves. Or maybe I had stopped looking for it. But by that point, I had completely different relationship with the occult. I wasn't that scared anymore. I had spent years at that point learning, studying, questioning, practicing, and eventually, with the help of my great grandmother and another person whose identity I cannot really share, I went through what I understood as a process of getting rid of those entities. Again, I'm sharing this as my experience and interpretation, not as a proof that supernatural entities objectively exist. Because there is a huge difference between saying, this happened to me, and saying, therefore, this must be the explanation for everyone. If there is one thing I wish I could tell to the young version of myself, is don't confuse curiosity with knowledge. I was so fascinated by the occult, but fascination isn't preparation. You don't become knowledgeable about a tradition simply because you found an old book. You don't understand demonology because you memorize an invocation. You don't understand sigil magic because you drew a symbol. And you definitely shouldn't perform rituals you don't understand simply because somebody online, I don't know, they told you they're working. Learn first, understand the history, understand where a practice comes from, understand what the symbols mean, understand why you're actually doing it and what you're actually doing it. And if you're serious about practicing a particular tradition, find someone experienced who is trustworthy, who can actually teach you. Not somebody who tells you that everything is a demon, not somebody who tells you every coincidence is a sign, not somebody who uses fear to control you. Oh, and definitely not somebody who tells you that you need to pay them a huge amount of money to remove a curse. A good teacher should make you more informed and more grounded, not more terrified. Now, after 16 years of practicing and studying witchcraft and occult tradition, I don't think I have all the answer, obviously. Actually, I would say quite the opposite. I still want to know, I still want to explore, I still want to answer questions that I don't know, and I think that curiosity is what actually pushes me to know more and dive more into things. The more I learn, the more I realize how much I don't know actually. And I think that's one of the most important lessons you can learn in any spiritual or occult practice. You should be able to say, I don't know. You should be able to question your own experiences. You should be able to change your mind, and you should be able to study tradition without immediately assuming every claim is factual. And you should be able to experience something mysterious without needing to invent an explanation for it immediately. For me, witchcraft has become a way of working with intentions, with symbols, rituals, and what I personally understand as energy. I see magical tools as way of focusing and channeling the intention towards an outcome. A candle can become a symbol, a sigil can become a visual representation of an intention, an altar can become a physical space dedicated to a particular practice. When I look back at the little girl who watched her great grandmother performing rituals, I don't see someone who was destined to become a witch. I see a child who was fascinated by mystery, by symbols, by story, by the possibility that there might be more of the word that she could actually immediately see. And maybe that's where my journey really began. Not with demons, not with curses, not with something supernatural, but with curiosity. My great grandmother gave me a doorway into a world I didn't understand. And for a long time, I rushed through that without even looking where I was going. I made mistake. I scared myself. I interpret experience through the knowledge I had at the time. And eventually I learned to slow down, to study, to question, to respect the tradition I was exploring. And most importantly, to respect myself. So if you're somebody who just discovered witchcraft or the occult practices and you're feeling the same fascination I felt as a child, I completely understand. That feeling of wanting to know more can be incredibly powerful. But please do not make the mistake I made. Don't jump into something just because it looks mysterious. Read, research, learn the history, learn about the culture behind the practice, learn the difference between historical traditions, modern occult movements, folk practices, and internet mythology. And most importantly, stay grounded. You don't need to be afraid of everything you don't understand. But you also don't need to believe everything you're told. Question things, including me perhaps. Because after 16 years, if there is one thing witchcraft has taught me, is that the journey isn't really about finding all the answer. It's about discovering better questions. And I know my journey isn't finished. Honestly, I don't think it ever will. Because maybe that's what fascinated that little girl at those years. The unknown. And even after 16 years, I'm still curious. Stay curious, stay grounded, and never stop learning. See you soon.